What's your name?
We know her really well.
I think so. So, it's a pleasure to have Natalie Struwe here, the workshop again. And I've had the pleasure of working with Natalie for several years, along with her other colleague now, Esther Blanco, who was her dissertation advisor. We're all excited about a paper we just got published in PNAS. It's very exciting.
Thanks, Jimmy.
I don't think I was quite as excited as Natalie and Esther, but I was excited. Let me put it that way. You get to my age, you don't want to get too excited. No, I'm missing the point that it's been a pleasure to work with both Esther and Natalie, but I've gotten to know Natalie well, and just an incredible portfolio of skills and interests. It's glad to have her at the workshop.
Thank you, Jimmy, so much. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to everyone at the workshop for having me, for being so incredibly inviting and welcoming and helpful. It's a pleasure being back. And yeah, I'm excited to share with you some of my research. This is well, maybe to those of you who don't know, I'm an experimental economist, so this will be an experiment. And this is joint work with Ivo, who is a postdoc at Marburg in Germany, and then Julian and Esther, who are both with me at Innsbruck. And as Jimmy has said, Esther is also a longtime affiliate here at the workshop. Let me start by giving you a brief overview of what this project is about. So this experiment will entail a social dilemma where there will be a potential damage to the group in the sense that the group might lose their resources. We will have collective and individual solutions to this social dilemma. And importantly, we will have asymmetric capacity of the individuals in the group to implement these solutions. We will be looking at 4 treatments where we will vary the degree of what we call strategic uncertainty. This is the uncertainty that I have about the cooperative behavior of others in my group. Why do we do this? We want to be able to explain the role that this uncertainty has in what we observe as self-reliance. So this overwhelming use of individual solutions to these shared problems, to these collective social dilemmas. We ran this experiment in our lab at the University of Innsbruck lab here. We have 400 participants. These are students, so very standard type of lab experiment. Everything was pre-registered online. And to sort of spoiler the main result, I guess it's in the title anyways, what do we find when we reduce strategic uncertainty? This improves the likelihood of cooperative outcomes, so the likelihood that the collective solution is being used, as well as efficiency in terms of welfare, resource loss avoided, and reduced inequality. We are motivated by this observation that there are large-scale collective risks that are conditioning both human and planetary well-being. I don't think I need to convince any of you about this. Just think of the climate crisis, the ecological emergency, the loss in ecosystems and biodiversity, the outbreak of pandemics, etc. Now, in order to reduce damages from these collective risks, we need cooperation to either mitigate these collective risks or by providing collective adaptation. Okay, this is what we call collective solutions. And by definition, these are public goods. So 2 examples here. One might be biodiversity protection to reduce the spread of potential zoonotic diseases. This would be an example for mitigation. An example for collective adaptation is when farmers are intentionally flooding their land in order to then provide flood protection to densely populated urban areas. Now, there are quite some studies in experimental econ that look at these so-called collective risk social dilemmas. And typically they study the determinants of cooperation in mitigating these collective losses and in situations where the group can only invest into these collective solutions. But at the same time, often individuals can privately protect themselves from these risks through private adaptation measures. So think, for example, about flood-proofing your own house. This is what we call individual solutions, and these are private goods, right? They only benefit the person that's implementing them. We know from the literature that the simultaneous availability of both individual and collective solutions to these shared problems leads individuals to inefficiently overuse these individual solutions. Now, what is not understood is what is the motivation for this self-reliance. Is it because people are selfish or self-interested? They don't want to invest into more expensive cooperative solutions? Or is it because they are uncertain about the cooperative behavior of others and they don't want to risk being not protected because others weren't cooperating? So this is what we want to address here. At the same time, we're adding another layer of complexity by acknowledging that there can be heterogeneity of individuals in their capacity to provide these collective and individual solutions. So there can be individuals, we call them now providers, who can implement either of these solutions. Okay? And then there can be individuals, and these we call the beneficiaries, who fully rely on the providers for protection. It can be due to geographical, technical, or institutional constraint. Now, these beneficiaries don't need to be fully helpless. There exist institutions, this is typically through NGOs, that allow the beneficiaries to send monetary transfers, so in the sense of donations, okay, to the providers in order to compensate them for their collective efforts. One of the most famous examples for such an institutions are payments for ecosystem services. Now, why do we care about these provider beneficiary complexity and these social dilemmas? Well, we know when there exist externalities to people who benefit from public goods, right, but they cannot provide them themselves, this usually worsens the social dilemma. So we observe less cooperation in these settings. At the same time, what we know, and this is research that I've been doing with Jimmy and Esther for a few years, that part of my dissertation, when we allow for these institutions, these voluntary institutional arrangements where we have these transfers, and when these transfers are shared proportional to cooperative efforts among the providers, we actually see an increase in cooperation. Okay, so these institutions have been shown to be helpful to increase cooperation in different settings. So this is the first time that we're looking at this institution in these collective risk settings, so where the group is facing a potential loss. So basically the contribution of this paper is that we are providing experimental evidence on the role that strategic uncertainty has in hindering cooperation in these special collective risk social dilemmas. Okay? The main novelty here is that only part of the group members will be capable of protecting themselves and others from damages, while others will rely on these people. We will be able to identify the extent to which this inefficient overuse of these individual solutions are actually motivated by strategic uncertainty rather than selfishness. And we will be able to identify in how far these voluntary institutions, these transfer arrangements, can help reduce strategic uncertainty and thereby alleviate the social dilemma. So how far we will see increases in the use of these collective solutions. Now, before I go into the details of the experimental design, I want to say a few words on why we think a lab experiment is informative in this case, right? So generally, the experimental method has this very powerful advantage that it allows us to identify behavioral responses to changes in decision environments that are at the root of causality. Okay? And we view these results from experiments as complementary to what we see in naturally occurring field settings, where there are often multiple and potentially even confounding variables at work. And by design, the experiments abstract away from most of these other factors. Now, in what refers to this paper specifically, because of the experiment, we can eliminate strategic uncertainty by sort of manipulating or constructing a decision environment that is like a hypothetical benchmark scenario that wouldn't be possible in a field setting or in the real world. And at the same time, we can then test that effectiveness in terms of behavioral responses, these institutional arrangements, to this constructed benchmark. All right. So what does the experiment look like? What are the decisions that people take? Let me start by the control condition. Okay. So there's a group of 6 people. We have 3 providers, these are the green people, and 3 beneficiaries, these are the orange ones. In every round, everyone starts with an endowment of 100 points. Okay. Importantly, maybe for those of you who don't know, these points at the end will be converted into money. So in our case, this was euro. People take real decisions. All of this is incentivized. People go home with actual money depending on their choices. So now out of these 100 points, the providers can decide how much to invest into a private pool, public pool, and how much to keep themselves. Importantly, the beneficiaries, these orange people, they remain inactive throughout. They don't do anything in this condition. Okay? If an individual is not protected at the end of a round, they lose all of their points. So the providers, they can be protected individually if they put 30 points into the private pool. And they go home with the remaining 70 points and they're fine. And then there is the collective protection. This happens as soon as there are 120 points in the public pool. If we reach this target in a group, then everyone in this group, all providers and all beneficiaries are protected, okay? Irrespective of how much they individually put. Now you can see, because this is 120 points, a single provider will not be able to establish this collective protection, okay? They need to cooperate to reach this target. And at the same time, if we were to divide these 120 points, the cost for this collective protection, the 3 people that can actually provide it, if we were looking at this in a sort of equal share, right, it would be 40 points, which is more expensive than if a provider would individually protect. So they have incentives to use the individual protection. From a group perspective, everyone would be better off with the collective protection, because otherwise we lose all the resources of the beneficiaries. Okay? This is what makes it a social dilemma.
But the providers, no. So the group, including the beneficiaries.
Yes, everyone, they know they are one group. They know that the beneficiaries fully rely on them. Otherwise, they will lose all of their points. So all of this is common knowledge.
Yeah. So without beneficiaries, you would be expecting that the providers will go for the private.
Yes, exactly. In that case, it's actually not a social dilemma.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly.
So an individual can protect themselves for 30 points. And they're sure they'll have it.
Yes, this is deterministic.
So there's 3 providers. So it would take 40 from each of them. So it was less expensive to provide yourself.
Yes.
Right, just want to be sure. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So there's
That's why transfers play a role.
Exactly. So in each of these conditions, we will always have 2 parts. Part 1 is just 5 decision rounds of this game. And then in part 2, they do 10 decision rounds of a game. Everyone stays in the same group throughout all of this. And in the control condition, it's a little bit unnecessary to have these 2 parts in a sense, because they're exactly the same. Okay, they do just 15 times these decisions. So there's high strategic uncertainty here. And now we go sort of sequentially with the next 3 conditions, reducing strategic uncertainty in this decision setting. The first one is the proportional treatment. Part one in this treatment is exactly the same as you just saw. So every time they start off with these passive beneficiaries. And then once we go into part two, we introduce the treatment differences. The providers face the same choices as before, but what differs now is that the beneficiaries become active. They can now use their resources to send these transfers to a so-called transfer account. The amount that is in this transfer account will be communicated to the providers before they make their choices. And then afterwards, these transfers are shared among these providers and they are shared proportionally to their cooperative effort, right? So relative to how much you put into the public pool compared to what the rest of your group. Why does this reduce strategic uncertainty? Well, we're sort of aligning the interests of the beneficiaries and the providers here, right? We're adding this monetary incentive for the providers to contribute to this collective solution, because then they're getting a share of the transfers.
And how much can they send?
Up to 100.
One.
Yes. So there can be a maximum of 300 points in this pool. And the idea here is that, of course, beneficiaries have incentives to send money because otherwise they will not be protected, right? They can anticipate that we need to be cooperative, otherwise we lose our points anyways. And there's, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's a Nash equilibrium here where the beneficiaries send sufficient transfers. They need to be actually very high for the providers to then invest sufficiently into the public pool. So we're shifting the Nash equilibrium to the social optimum. Okay, so this is basically based on monetary incentives. Okay, and then we're adding another behavioral level, basically, in the next treatment. This is the pledges. We have a question?
No. Is there a mix at some point between providing 30 private, contributing 30 transfer? Like, is there any, not, it would be 30, but like, is there any mixed strategy between?
Actually, no. So I think what is, so the model only shows that the beneficiaries need to send, I think it's 180 in some in transfers. And then the providers all have an incentive to put exactly these 120 into the pool. What we will see, there's a quite, I think, a focal point of what happens if we share this 120 by all 6 in the group, and then every beneficiary would send 20 transfers. And this is actually what we see in the data. I think this is more obvious for people to see. No. I think it's great if you're asking questions for the design right now.
So that's the unique Nash here.
Yes, actually, there's a unique Nash, yeah.
It sounds
There is not a Nash at 0 anymore because of these proportional sharing of the transfers. Once you have transfers and only one of the providers puts in 1 point to the public pool, they get all of the transfers. So there's sort of like a race to the top for the providers to contribute to the public good in a sense. This is different to the threshold public good games where you have 2 equilibria.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, so this pledges treatment is exactly the same as the proportional. Okay, we have these transfers and so on, but we're adding a behavioral element to even further alleviate strategic uncertainty by allowing providers and the beneficiaries to communicate in a sense. Okay, and we do this in the simplest form. They will have the possibility to send non-binding numerical pledges, like a promise on their planned contributions to either the transfer account or the public pool. Okay? So this is sort of like a communication device where you can signal your planned cooperativeness in a given round. And this should help reduce the uncertainty that I have about the cooperative intentions of the others in my.
And before they were playing sequentially, or they were playing.
This is sequential. So always the orange people, the beneficiaries move first.
First, okay.
They send their transfers. And then this transfer account, the sum, the pot, is communicated to the providers. They make their decisions, and thereafter they receive their share transfers.
And then communication, what would that? If previously you knew that,
You are
The
talking in the
transfers.
same round. So basically, the beneficiaries, they all make their promise, and then this is shown to them, and then they make the choice, right?
see,
So I can even see afterwards how much people deviated from their promises. I cannot track, what we eliminate is that people can track over rounds. So this is sort of randomly shown every round. We shuffle the IDs, right? But you can, in a given round, you can see how much people deviated. And of course, this has an impact on your decision in the next round.
Can you give us a quick summary of how much they deviate?
I want you.
Are
I'm
you
not
getting-
sure that we have actually looked, so we look at whether if you deviate, how much this changes your behavior. I'm not sure we have looked at how much they on average deviate. I would have to check.
It's just kind of.
Usually these,
Reminds me of if you just had a threshold public good
yeah,
and where people could make these suggestions or
Yeah.
whatever, we call them. It would be an interesting mechanism to study.
it's
It has an
helpful in the sense because often with these targets, right, it's this threshold, we need to reach this 120. The worst that can happen is that you end up very closely below that, right? Because then you've invested a lot of money, but you don't reach the target. So in the sense, this should help people understand how much does everyone have to chuck in, right? And how much is everyone planning on giving? So in theory, these non-binding pledges don't do anything, right? They're called cheap talk by experimentalists. But we see in practice that there are cases where they are helping in achieving more cooperation.
Are the pledges made all simultaneously?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be the case that like, because I know that you did 60, that I know that in some 4 of us, we each need to pledge like. 15.
Exactly. You're doing it simultaneously. Although you're doing it over multiple rounds, right? So while I cannot track an individual in my group, I can of course see what are the other 2 doing over time. So sort of, it does give you an idea of, okay, maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe if I pledge more next time, they will also. We do have this sort of dynamic.
Quick question, so efficiently, you want the on the right, the green guys, providers. Who end up 40 each, right?
Doesn't necessarily matter how much they each do, they should end up at 120, but yeah, if we assume they're all the same, then 40, yes.
Is there a value of going over?
There's a value if there is transfers, and well, this is all redistributive, right? So in terms of efficiency, we don't care. But there are actually incentives for the providers to give more than reach this target because they might get a higher share of the transfers.
I was also just thinking back to the original part 1 as well. So there.
No, they should go, they should,
That would be like a threshold public good with
Yes.
no value going up.
exactly, you don't want to be over 120 because that's just losing resources in a sense. So it's not a linear public good where the more you put in, the better.
Right, this,
Yeah.
It's the first one, but by the time the proportionality kicks in.
Here, it's still, you want to be from the point of efficiency, you want to be at the 120. However, because these people are sending you transfers for individual, there might be incentives to do more, get more of that because of this proportional sharing, right? And this doesn't hurt efficiency because it's a redistribution from one person to the other. Okay, let me go to the final treatment where we fully eliminate strategic uncertainty. And this was sort of this hypothetical case that I wanted to make here. How do we do that? We collapse group size to the minimum. Okay, this is what we call the single provider beneficiary treatment. We're looking at the minimum possible group size that there can be, 1 provider and 1 beneficiary. There's no strategic uncertainty anymore because anything that these people do is deterministic. Okay, so basically the setup is the same. This provider can do the individual protection for 30 points, or they put in 10 more points to this public pool. They protect themselves and the beneficiary. Now this is deterministic, right? There is no uncertainty about, well, do we reach this collective target if others are helping? No, it's just, am I willing to put in more money to invest to protect this other person? So here we only have self-interest or pro-social motivations that are at play. Again, in the first 5 rounds, this beneficiary is inactive, and then they can send these transfers that now go directly to this one provider.
You have unique NASH, no cooperation when they cannot transfers, and 1030, that would be the unique NASH, subgame NASH when they can send transfers, no? And say the minimum one, so it's for
Actually,
you
here, it's still,
an epsilon more than 10, no?
it's actually here, the Nash equilibrium for self-interested people is always for the provider to put in 0 for the public pool and just protect themselves, because even if this beneficiary was sending transfers, this person receives them anyways, right? There's no competition in a sense for the transfers.
Okay,
So they would just pocket this money. Great, I get more. I go home myself because I don't care about this other person, right? I maximize my income by just keeping all of the transfers myself, protect myself. I'm happy. Of course, in the next round, this beneficiary is not stupid. They wouldn't send transfers anymore. But still, this provider is better off just putting 30.
It's kind of like a repeated dictator game. It's
In the sense that it,
a version of it.
yes,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah. Also a little bit like a trust game, although you don't have the multiplicator. This idea of, okay, I'm sending you
I think
resources and I hope you.
In part 1,
Part 1, it's a dictator game, yes. Part 2, it's more, to me, it's more like a trust game. I'm sending you something and I hope that you use this something to protect me. So from a pure self-interest perspective, of course, we wouldn't see collective protection here, but at least it wouldn't be due to strategic uncertainty. That's the idea, right? So here we can then disentangle, are people pro-social and putting in more money to protect this other person, or are they being self-interested? Right. So let me jump into the results. And we start with this effect of the minimum group size, okay? So we start with the causal effect that eliminating strategic uncertainty has on cooperative outcomes. We do this by only looking at part 1. And this is this was the decision setting where there was always the passive beneficiaries. The only thing that differs here is it a 1 person making the decision, or is it 3 person making these decisions, okay? We pool in the blue all of the situations where this was a group providers. We compare this to the red, was the single provider making choices. We have here the average outcomes for the implementation of the collective solutions, contributions to this collective solutions, and the implementation of individual solutions. Okay? The first thing we see here is when there's a group of providers making decisions, only about 11% of times we see the collective solution happen. However, when it is a single provider, this jumps up to almost 50% of the time. To understand the causal treatment effect, we need to look at the treatment differences. So these are the regression estimated causal effects. Okay. And what do we see? Well, when we eliminate strategic uncertainty, we increase the use of this collective solution by almost 40 percentage points. So strategic uncertainty plays a big role. So when we eliminate it, we see much more cooperation. Of course, one note, selfishness is a relevant motivation here because we also see a lot of individual protection still happening with the individual provider. Now, we're interested in, well, how do these voluntary institutions compare to this? So we look at the causal effect of introducing these transfers to the groups. For this, we need to look at the part 2 behavior. This is when we introduce these treatment differences to the groups, right? Up here we have again the average outcomes. Now we're looking at the control treatment. This was the passive beneficiaries throughout. We compare this to proportional, the pledges, the single provider beneficiary. Again, the outcome that is most of interest to us is the one here on the left, the implementation rate of the collective solution. And I think to understand the treatment differences, it's easiest if we look down here, what I marked in red. These are the regression estimated causal treatment effects. Okay, so this is the effect of how much more do we see the collective solution because we introduced these transfer institutions. And we see here these proportional transfers increase the use of the collective solution significantly and quite substantially. Same, we see a significant reduction in the use of the individual solutions. It's kind of hand in hand. We further see that the pledges treatment, this is this T2 here, does a little bit better. So adding these communication devices in average terms does a little bit better. It's not significant in our data. Now, this might be a point about how much power do we have? Are these effects too small and so on? So not making too much claims about this, okay? And then finally, you might wonder, well, what about these beneficiaries? What do they do? How much transfers do they send? Sort of said this before. This, I think we can see best up here, average transfers. So in all of these treatments, they send above or equal to what we would think is this cost sharing amount. Okay, so if we divided the cost of this collective solution by the number of people in the group, so by 6, 2, depending on the case, this ends up at 20, and they are all pretty much at this 20 on average, right? So I think they really see this focal point. Okay, let's do the fair share. Everyone puts in their fair amount and we go all home with the same amount of money. This is what they do. So also to notice, people make use of these voluntary institutions, right? They don't have to. Don't force anyone to do it. They make use of it and they work. So these are the main results. And then we went a little bit further on exploring the effects of these treatments on welfare in the group, on inequality, and so on. And we have basically 2 more slides that look very similar to what we've just looked at. So first, we are looking at the effects of eliminating strategic uncertainty. Again, this group size reduction effect in part 1. And let's just look at the treatment differences here. When we eliminate strategic uncertainty, so when we have one provider versus a group of providers making choices, this results in higher welfare of beneficiaries. So this is the payoff that they go home with, right? It results in less resource waste. So we measure this by looking at what's the social optimum amount of resources in a group and how far away are you from that, each group. So we have less resource waste and we have lower inequality as measured by the Gini. How different are the payoffs within a group? Okay. So again, this is the effect of eliminating strategic uncertainty. Now we can look at what do these transfer institutions do. And here I want to highlight what I have here in the red box. It's actually the pledges treatment that improves outcomes in all of these domains. So the treatment where we had these proportional transfers and these communication devices. Here we have an increase in payoffs to the providers, the beneficiaries. We're reducing resource waste and we're reducing inequality. So I know this was a lot. Let me try to wrap it up before we go to the Q&A. What have we done here? We've identified the very large role that strategic uncertainty plays on this observed over-reliance on individual solutions. How can we say so? Well, in the absence of strategic uncertainty, the single provider beneficiary setting, we see that individuals are willing to forego a significant share of their income to achieve these collective solutions, right? To protect this beneficiary. But as soon as we enter in this uncertainty about the operative behavior of others, we see that this crowds out the cooperation or the pro-social behavior would have been there otherwise. Actually, we're very close to the Nash equilibrium result of what self-interested people would do. And so this uncertainty then leads to failures to solve these shared problems. And we think this is important because when we are understanding the motivations for the behavior that we observe for the self-reliance, this can help us to design institutions that actually target the motivations that are underlying here, right? And then lead to more operative outcomes that we see. What we think is a very promising result here from policy perspective is that the introduction of these proportional arrangements actually achieved similar increases in efficiency as this sort of hypothetical case of fully eliminating strategic uncertainty. Okay, so we can, in a sense, similarly alleviate this collective risk social dilemma. Thank you. I don't see who was first. Okay, you were definitely first, Gustavo. I can wait.
May I go with a clarification question for the results? Maybe it's so I got the result about the transfers. Okay, so but I'm trying a little bit to understand the result related to the strategic uncertainty. Okay, so let me see if I got it right. So the reason when you have you collapse everything to one member is that they shouldn't be contributing anything, no? They should be going, so you should doing, so if you're pure self-interest,
Yes.
zero transfers, and then private protection, or if you don't have transfers, well, private protection, okay? But because they are pro-social, they do it, okay? That's the reason.
Yes. So
And then pro-sociality is diluted when you are in a group. Okay, so that's, did I get it right? So
we can estimate, we can see that if there is no strategic uncertainty, there is a share of people who are willing to protect these other people, right? So this must be cooperative or pro-social concerns. And if we don't see this anymore in the case where we add uncertainty, then it must be because the uncertainty crowds out this.
So let me go. So it's a very weird pro-sociality that you are getting, because I am pro-social, but as soon as somebody else is willing to step in with his or her pro-sociality, I become a free rider, no? I expect that free riding will prevail. So I collapse my pro-sociality.
I mean, at the end of the
Something
day,
like that, no?
I think what is going on is that often, this is what we see most often, is that people are conditionally cooperative.
I see.
Right? So if it's just me, I want to be cooperative. I know that no one will take advantage of this, then I do the nice thing. Now, if I expect I'm in a group and I expect others will not cooperate, so I will also not cooperate anymore because I'm conditionally cooperative, right? So as soon as we have this sort of dynamics going on, and also people don't want to be taken advantage of.
Exactly, you need something like that, no?
And then at the same time, it's not like in a linear public good where everything good that I do, even if others are free riding, it always benefits everyone. Here, I have this problem that if I am cooperative, but the others are not, then I lose everything, right? So I need to protect myself from,
But if you are pro-social with 1-1, you can replicate exactly that same thing, and are you going to?
no, because I might not be able to protect myself. Right, so if we are in a group and I want to be cooperative and I put in my share in this public pool, but the others don't, then I lose
So,
my own protection.
okay, but here I'm confused. With 1-1, can you reach the target 120 or you cannot?
With 1-1, the target is 40.
Oh,
So
the
it-
target
it-
is
it's
40.
it's
Oh.
the same, exactly.
See.
So, and then that's why it's deterministic, right?
You move away from a threshold public
Oh.
situation to
I
a
see,
trust or
I see.
dictator game.
I see.
But there's one comment on this. You got multiple groups within a treatment. I bet you there's a big difference between the first period in the treatment. What happens in that? The first treatment, let's say I give in the first, this is treatment 2, and I'm in a group where I give 40 and everybody else gives 40. But what happens after that versus any failure at all in the first round? So it could be you get a really sort of breakdown between both groups in those treatments, potentially.
Yeah, so we have here plotted, I don't know how good you can see this. This is all the 20 groups that we have in the proportional treatment over time, right? And the dash lines are the transferred, the solid line is the or actually it's a contribution to the collective solution. And I mean, we can see how even though this treatment worked very well, there's groups who will never make it to this threshold. They try, and there's transfers sent. So it's not that they fully give up. Right? They try, but they don't make it. And then there's groups who, once they reach it once, they stay up there all the time. So there's a lot of variation going on here. And there's a lot of what happened previously and how do we react to this in the future.
But it seems like that would be much stronger in a threshold type environment. When you don't meet the threshold than in a continuous.
Yeah, to some extent, I'm surprised that this looks relatively similar to the ones we have in the linear public goods. It does not seem that everyone completely gives up. Just because we missed the target once, okay, I never invest again, right?
If I invest and say others don't, I get let's just say I give 40. Do I get the private protection?
No, you need to decide.
It's not a choice between the.
It's not adding up in a sense, right? You can flood-proof your house,
I missed
or
that.
you can invest into this other. I mean, you can do both, of course. If you have enough money, you don't need to decide. You can distribute. But then you're going home
Do I do
with
this
this.
or do I do that? And how much?
So an example that I can think of that is like here in the US, for instance, buying flood insurance in ways, for community, a collective effort, right? States require, like in certain areas, are required to have certain types of insurance. And so that means it's protect your home, but it also protects like banks. It's supposed to provide extra coverage. In a sense, could you think of that as collective, coupled with, say, individual efforts
I think I would have thought this is more of an individual protection type because it protects your home, no?
I mean, if it's required by the state, is it really purely individual? Auto insurance is the same thing.
Sure.
There's these really strict rules on building in Florida now.
Yeah.
And I think part of the rules come from the externality on what insurance costs,
Yeah.
but also you have roofs being blown off.
Yeah.
and Other houses damage,
Right.
personal damage. So there's,
So
so when you take these, you put the money into your house in this way, you're creating a private good for yourself, but you're also.
has a positive
And think
externality.
about the guy, right, who secured his roof by, getting straps. That was all over the news. And yet his roof didn't fly off. That was a personal individual initiative, but like you said, his roof
It
didn't.
has some collective adaptation.
Yeah.
It'd be true sometimes. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
Brian has his hand up and then I have a question.
Is that for me? Hello?
Yes.
Ryan?
Jesse, was that for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I've two clarification questions. First of all, in terms of how you're using the term focal point, just for clarity, is that a situation where there are multiple equilibria in terms of how you get to 120 points, but different ways of dividing up those contributions, one of which happens to be equal shares?
So the focal point so this to us is just how we thought about what is the natural thing that people might be having in their head. This might by no means be the only thing. But if you think about, you come in and we tell you, well, this costs 120 and you're 6 people in the group, you might do the math and come up with, if everyone pays 20, we all go home the same. This might be considered the fair thing, and that's what they might be thinking about as the focal point. So this is what we had in mind. And then in terms of Nash equilibria, there's only unique ones. So it's either at the selfish, where the providers only protect themselves, or we have the one at the social optimum when we have the proportional transfers. And this, well, assuming that all our agents are the same, right? We have symmetric people in there, then they will all put in the 40 to this.
Okay, but if they're not symmetric people, they could contribute different amounts as long as they get to the threshold.
Yes,
So in that
exactly.
case,
Yes.
The symmetric one arguably would be a focal point because people recognize it and pick that one out of many possible equilibria. Okay.
Yeah, no, this
that.
is a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. That is the clarification. The second clarification are more about the motivation in terms of this approach to transfers for like payment for ecological services. I usually think of payment for ecological services coming from like a government or utility, paying to protect the watershed or some government funded project. But you are setting up something in terms of private transfers. So if there's some examples of why is that what you're finding interesting to explore, real world cases of those kind of individual level transfers. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, there are actually a number of initiatives where these payments for ecosystem services are not government funded. So to us, the government funded programs would more be like subsidies, which are different to these voluntary institutions. One of the examples that I think it's really great is this Trillion Tree campaign, where you log on to the website and you can pay farmers all over the world that are planting trees, and you really will one donation, they tell you how much a tree costs and you pay for that tree. So, and then you can track what happens with your tree, basically. So there's many of these also voluntary or donation-based programs where the money is then used. It's usually collected by an NGO, who then in the field makes the contracts with the farmers or whatever ecosystem you're looking at. And this is actually substantial. I mean, there's a lot of money being transferred here every year.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So I have a couple of questions. I'm not sure yet if they're clarifying or if they're actual questions, so sorry in advance. So these are averages, right?
Yes.
So one question I have is about understanding risk aversion. So it seems like how much you care about strategic uncertainty is a function of your own risk aversion, right? Like maybe I feel strongly pro-social, but like having high risk aversion means that I'm like, that is going to be more easily crowded out than if I have low risk aversion. And so I'm curious if you have variance Right, if there's anything to be said about that, right, because I mean, you have different participants, so I'm not super worried about it as like a confounding, but I would be curious to understand the extent to which in some ways the role, I don't want you to add another conditional, but like the role of strategic uncertainty is in some ways a function of individual levels of individual risk aversion. I'm not really sure how central that is, other than it's really, I mean, strategic uncertainty is literally like, do you want to differentiate between, I don't want to get screwed over by being the chump in the room versus like, I'm inherently worried about this.
Mhm.
That's one question that I have. Again, not sure if that's like, so, and another one has to do with, and okay, so related to that, would those people learn differently over the course of the rounds? Right, and what could that tell us about these averages, right? Then second has to do with like evaluation of sort of credit claiming here, right? So like in the individual, like in the single transfer beneficiary, right? Like if it is successfully provided, it is you and only you that did that, and everybody knows that. Okay. In the second, when there's many people, right? That is less of an option, right? Where you would be recognized as a central contributor who, right, especially because they can't see exactly how much everybody ended up contributing.
So we have individual feedback, but it's not traceable over rounds in that sense, where obviously it's the case in the single setting.
So conflating the strategic uncertainty is the extent to which someone can say, I'm the person sole responsible for everyone's collective benefit. And I wouldn't necessarily think that you should explicitly build that into their like utility function, but in the same extent to which people care about not having not being the chump in the room, they also care about like being the person that successfully, right? And so again, like this kind of goes to individual level, like micro foundations and motivations for like the way that individuals are thinking about this, but I'm just curious if there's like, maybe this is a separate paper, but like variation in like the variance that leads, right, that you've got the averages here, but you could look at variation to try to understand like if there are trends that might sort of map from risk aversion,
Yeah.
right? And or sort of like valuation of being able to claim sole credit for.
Yeah, these are great points. We haven't thought about either of those specifically. So I would need to think about it some more. So what we do is we have these sort of post-experimental questionnaire where we ask for motivations. Why did you behave the way you did? And we see high levels of mistrust everywhere. As opposed to obviously the single case, you can't mistrust others. But we see this quite a lot, but we don't see it influencing their behavior. Now, of course, mistrust is different from risk aversion. We don't have this, you're always smarter afterwards, right? And we don't have this specific question of, I am inherently afraid of losing my resources. I think would be very interesting because it's a similar, possibly it would result in the same behavior that we see, but it's a similar type of explanation for why people choose to behave as if they are selfish when the underlying motivation is not selfishness, right? I think this is very interesting and important to look at. At the same time, if an institution works in alleviating these concerns, maybe it still matters because maybe we could still do better if there's a reason to think that these treatments are maybe helping those that are afraid of the uncertainty, but not necessarily those that are inherently still risk averse, right?
And the uncertainty sort of then also sort of gets me to thinking about some of the work on like Jenna Bednar has a paper where it's like sort of like based on the sort of like entropy principle of like what you learn over time based on how difficult it is to figure out optimal strategy.
Yeah.
It's related, but anyway, I don't want to go on too long because I know Mike has his hand up and I think, yeah, so Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure, thanks. This is, I'm having some trouble wrapping my mind around this because I think I focused on the wrong part of your setup, and I sort of help explain. Does this make sense? Help explain why I got confused, and some other readers might get confused too. You're starting with a very nice setup in terms of there being two fundamentally different kinds of actors, in that you've got these providers who are able to actually do something about this collective action problem, something, or at least something more significant that would provide benefits to other people. And then you've got less powerful actors, if you will, who you're treating as beneficiaries, who can do maybe few things for themselves, the private sort of things, but they can't really do anything on their own on the big sort of issues. So you've got these real asymmetric actors, okay? And I think that's a really important aspect of these kinds of games to build into a game. But then you end up having 3 beneficiaries and 3 providers. And that initial asymmetry led me to expect a situation where there are lots of potential beneficiaries and only a few potential service providers, okay? Or you go all the way to the extreme and it's a government policy agency of some sort of doing this. But I think it's a more natural fit to you as having multiple service providers that are somehow providing services to these beneficiaries. But you don't match them up in any one-on-one situation except on your last treatment, where you just have one of each. And it seems to me that a more natural, or maybe that's not quite the right word, but an alteration in the way you lay out this structure that might give you a lot more purchase on a broader range of policy kinds of dilemmas is if you have something like competing service providers who benefit from having more beneficiaries, okay? And so the beneficiary stuff, the contributions don't just go to a pool that somehow gets distributed, but that there's more of a competitive aspect to that. Almost a patron-client even kind of relation, but I think maybe service providers. We're having a new fiber optic cable company putting into our development here, and so we're going to have more competition than we didn't have before. I can't run a cable sort of thing myself. Anyway, so does this make any sense? Do you see this type of experiment leading to eventually being able to get to a more natural sort of configuration of a small number of service providers and a large number of beneficiaries, where it's not just the other regarding sort of aspect of it, but there's a real competitive aspect to what the service providers are doing? Or does that just seem like something totally different? Like I said, how I sort of got off track and sort of saw this a little differently.
Thank
Ask
you,
Jimmy
Mike.
if you ever wonder, if you wonder how I can sort of get these really strange interpretations of these
I
experiments.
don't even know who this guy is.
No, I think these are great points, and they are certainly points that we've thought about.
Okay.
Now, there is one sort of problem that we always face with experiments is that this type of setup that you're talking about would entail us to have much more people.
Yeah.
And much more groups, and we need a lot of groups to have statistical power, right? And so it's not only a point about money, obviously it's a constraint, but also about the subject pool that we have available to make these decisions with. We actually had at some point thought of a design. It was in a linear public good setting where we would have these groups of providers competing for resources from beneficiaries, which I think it's similar to what you're saying. And of course, introducing much more asymmetry in the providers and the beneficiaries, be it in the number that they are there, be it in the welfare that they have. So now everyone is endowed with the same. This is just one of the ways we would look at it, because we want this setting, we didn't want to look at, well, I think it is helping us to understand what we are after here, right? But it's by no means the only thing that it's interesting. So understanding endowment or income inequality in these settings, I think it's extremely interesting, especially if we're thinking about payments for ecosystem services, where there are certainly wealth differences between the ecosystem providers and the beneficiaries. And this, I think this idea of large groups of beneficiaries, my assumption would be is that getting to a cooperation equilibrium will be more difficult. So the larger the group and the less people that would put in resources to benefit everyone else is probably making it difficult. But then it's interesting to look at how these institutions would play a role here. I think that's it's a great idea. It's a nice setting. I don't know how would possibly be able to do it in a lab with the subject pools that we have. Of course, it's possible now to do online experiments where you can run larger settings, but then you're losing some of the control, given that this is quite a difficult experiment, I think. So there's also all these trade-offs that we're facing, right? But no, I think these are great add-ons for future experiments, for sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't want to go too much over time, but I did want to know what you mean by strategic uncertainty.
It's the uncertainty that I have about the behavior of others. So
Okay.
this
I don't
idea
understand.
of-
I don't understand what's strategic about that.
Because your choice is a strategic, so we're in a strategic decision environment, right? The social dilemma is a strategic decision environment. So that your self-interest is at odds with the group interest, social interest. And this idea of, I might want to be pro-social or cooperative, but I don't know what the others will do. So I'm afraid of losing my resources. So I behave as if it was self-interested, but it's not because I'm actually that way, but it's because I'm uncertain about the behavior of others. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I have an idea to this point, but I think we're running out of time. We can talk later if you want.
I'm here. So,
Okay.
well, thank you everyone so much.